This is the Lou Rockwell Show.
A couple of years ago, I was talking to an LRC reader on the phone, and he was sort of joking with me. And he said, I do have one problem with your site. He said, you're really practicing a form of fraud. And I said, a form of fraud? And he said, yeah, you get this guy, this obviously adult writer, posing as a high school kid. And he said, it's really not a good thing to do. And I said, are you talking about Max Raskin? He said, yes. And I said, well, let me assure you, Max is a high school kid. And at this point, I think he was towards the end of his sophomore year. And I urge you to take a look at his archive on LRC, take a look at his columns, and we're very glad to have him here today. Max has just graduated from high school in New Jersey. He's going to NYU this fall, full of wonderful stories about his high school years, as I'm sure he will be about his college years. But one thing in particular interested me was his encounters with his various history teachers and the way history is taught in a significant high school in a very significant part of the country. So, Max, how about talking a little bit about that first high school teacher, the one who had the poster on the wall?
Okay, so my teacher in sophomore year was an Irish Catholic woman who was very interested in giving us alternate interpretations of history and asking us to challenge the status quo. So she had a poster up on her wall of Lincoln's quote to Horace Greeley saying that his paramount objective in the Civil War was neither to save the slaves or to keep the slaves, but rather to save the Union. And I always thought that was interesting because it shows that you can still be a mainstream teacher, yet have unorthodox views that you share with your students and ask them to challenge what the book says.
I think, of course, Tom DiLorenzo has done such a fantastic job of breaking through the barriers of the state religion and the God Lincoln with his two books on Lincoln. And he's about to do it, by the way, with a new book on Alexander Hamilton. But still, I find it astounding that a high school teacher would actually have a truth-telling poster of that sort. So she obviously was an unusual lady, but the next year you had somebody who's maybe more typical of a high school history teacher.
The next 2 years, I had the same teacher who taught me from the Progressive Era up to modern history, and then this year she taught me European history, and she was, of course, much more typical of what a libertarian would think a public high school teacher would be. She, of course, idolized the state and thought that the Progressive Era was really a movement against backward-thinking conservatives, and, the whole thing, the Great Depression, was caused by the free market. World War II got us out of the Depression. Every sort of inconsistency that Tom Woods deals with in his book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, I get in high school class. And it's interesting to decide what kind of strategy you want to take when you're in this situation, because obviously I have ideological beliefs, so it puts me in an awkward position. Do I sit there and try to contradict the teacher and point out the mistakes that I think she makes in class, and then I look like the smart-ass kid who's just sitting in the corner mouthing off? Or do I write in my papers what I really think, or do I write on the test what I really think? And so I think this is a problem not just for libertarians, but it's a problem for anyone who has any political beliefs, and really the state apparatus makes it difficult for you to put forth your own critical thinking views without getting penalized in some way.
Max, don't you think that in some sense the public schools actually are designed to suppress critical thinking? I mean, they don't want to dumb down the students, although that's the normal claim, and I think that is the effect. But that's they still want scientists and engineers, mathematicians for the military-industrial complex, for example. But they don't want critical thinking. They don't want independent thinking. Some teachers, even although they have strong ideological views, are open to discussing things with the students. So that, of course, others are not. Was this teacher didn't want to hear anything, just wanted the official view?
Well, the thing is, the class was geared towards taking the test for American history. So the kind of questions that were asked on the test were mostly factual questions, and they didn't give much interpretation. Now, there was a section on the test called the document-based question, and that question would ask something like, analyze the responses to the peasant revolt in Germany, or something like that. Now, the whole point of the tests and the whole point of the school system is not to get you to think about what your response is to these things, not to give you any chance to give your opinion about it, but rather analyze these documents they give you and say what the responses of other people were, and then analyze whether those responses were accurate responses. And they can pick and choose which responses they use. So in a sense, it's not that critical thinking is stifled, it's that it's just never given an opportunity to manifest itself.
Tell me about the time that the congressman came to visit.
In science class, a astronaut was brought to the class, and the congressman came to us, and afterwards I went up with some of my friends, and I said to the congressman, where in the Constitution does it give you the right to sort of send up spaceships and waste my money on that? And of course he said, well, you must be a Ron Paul fan. And I said, well, I mean, you don't have to be a Ron Paul fan to sort of grasp the English language and be able to read Article 1, Section 8, where it, clearly defines the power of the federal government and of the Congress. And he said something like, oh, well, the General Welfare Clause gives us this power. It gives us the right to decide how we spend your money. And I said, well, then how can you fault Democrats for spending money on their pet projects when you're perfectly willing to do the same? And he said, well, that's one opinion to take. Of course, it's the right opinion. But
What about the government astronaut? Did he have any comments?
no, he was spinning from getting back from space. I don't know. He was a space case.
The point you make about it, what is a student who has strong ideological views that differ from the establishment and from the states? What do you do? Do you tell them what they want to hear and learn what you can from the regular structure while teaching yourself outside of the regular structure by reading the books of the Mises Institute, for example? Or do you try to argue? Of course, it becomes even more of a problem in college, even more of a problem in graduate school. Some people would argue that you just get through, you get your credential, especially if you're wanting to teach, that you just have to get the credential and then you have to learn the truth on your own outside of the apparatus. On the other hand, it's fun to argue with the teacher or the professor, but it becomes more and more difficult. College is more difficult than high school and graduate school. They don't want to hear. They're all little gods, and they typically don't want to hear any dissenting views. So it's a problem. What have you thought about this? What are you just going to sort of play it by ear? What are you going to do at NYU?
Well, what I did in high school was I definitely played it by ear. I think the most important thing is to recognize that these are teachers, and they're pretty good people. They're not out to – they don't think of themselves as indoctrinating us, and they don't think of themselves as pushing an agenda that one of their classmates would disagree with. So once you realize that they're generally nice people, you don't have to confront them in any sort of aggressive way. So what I steered away from was arguing in front of the class, deliberately calling out the teacher. Instead, I would always just say, I would always add an interesting fact that I thought was a different interpretation and see what the teacher thought about it. Now, the more important thing was that gave me the opportunity during the tests when I disagreed with a question. I made it clear to the teacher, and she would sometimes give me points back if they were to, for instance, ask a question, what caused the Great Depression? And they gave all these 4 book views, underconsumption, a lack of regulation in the market, and those sort of things. I would go up to the teacher during the test and say, if I can give me a sheet of paper why I disagree with the 4 answers and why I think they're all wrong, will you give me the points? And she said, yeah, because I had, not really done anything deliberate in class. So I think it's possible to do well in school and still have ideological beliefs as long as you're able to gauge situations and understand exactly how and how not to approach the teacher.
Max, I think that's exactly right. Some people are punks, and even though they may be saying the right thing, it's a problem with the other students. It's obviously a problem with the professor or with the teacher. And there's much to learn from these people. Even if you have a Marxist professor, there's much to learn from Keynesians. And good manners are always important. And respect for somebody who knows more than you is also a good thing. And of course, these people do know much more than the student knows in their own, certainly in their own areas of specialization. So I think it sounds to me like you've got exactly the right strategy for a libertarian in the educational world.
And I really think the simple fact of the matter is that most students just don't care. And who are you going to win over by arguing with the teacher in front of the class? You're going to be the kid who annoys the teacher and annoys the students. Instead, you have to recognize that most of these kids who are learning in high school history class aren't going to go on to become history professors. And if they do, they're going to be more indoctrinated in college with whatever they decide to follow. So I think what's important is to recognize that it's sort of like saying the pledge. People who make a big deal about saying the pledge. If you go to the ground and talk to kids who are in school, they just don't care. It's like it's like a mental vacation for like a minute. No one really cares. The bigger question is when you go up and you start trying to defend these things in an intellectual level, then how do you go to proceed? And I think that in college and in the real world, that's where you have to fight your intellectual battles, not in the high school.
Max, thanks very much, and I want to urge everybody to take a look at Max's archive. Click on columnists on LouRockwell.com on the left-hand side, and then look at Max Raskin's archive, look at his articles, and I hope we're going to have many more good articles from him when he's in college and after college, and hope that we have him back on the podcast too. Max, thanks very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Lou Rockwell Show, produced by LouRockwell.com, the best-read libertarian website in the world. If you'd like to advertise on this podcast or on the website, email advertise@LouRockwell.com. And thanks for listening.